The ink on my husband's death certificate was barely dry when my daughter suggested I give her power of attorney. She said it so gently, sitting across from me at the kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea she'd made without asking, the way she'd been doing everything since the funeral without asking. "It's just practical, Mom. You're grieving. You shouldn't have to deal with paperwork right now." Her husband sat beside her and nodded slowly, the way he always did when she spoke, like a man who had practiced looking reasonable for a very long time. I was 68 years old. I had worked 31 years as a registered nurse. I had held the hands of dying strangers and talked their families through the worst moments of their lives with a steadiness that my colleagues sometimes called a gift. But sitting in that kitchen, 2 weeks after burying the man I'd spent 43 years beside, I felt something I had never felt in any hospital corridor. I felt small, so I signed the paper. "I want you to understand something before I go any further. My daughter is not a monster. She is my child, and I love her the way you can only love someone you once carried inside your own body, someone whose first breath you counted as the greatest miracle of your life. But love, I have learned, does not protect you from what people are capable of when money is involved. Love does not lock the door." My husband had been methodical about our finances his entire life. He kept a binder 3-ring, navy blue, the kind you find in any office supply store, and in it he recorded every account, every policy, every investment we had ever made together. Checking, savings, the IRA he'd rolled over 3 times, the small brokerage account with the utilities, stocks he'd bought back in 1987 and never sold. The mortgage on our house in Clarksville had been paid off 11 years ago. We were not wealthy people, but we were careful people. And careful, over 40 years, looks a lot like wealthy from a certain angle. When my daughter asked me to grant her power of attorney, she said it was so she could handle things. If something happened, if I had a medical emergency, if I became unable to manage on my own. She pointed to her father's last months, the confusion that had set in near the end, the bills that had gone unopened on the counter. "We don't want that for you, Mom." I heard love in her voice. I am still not sure it wasn't there, underneath everything else. The first 6 months after my husband passed, she was attentive in a way that felt like being watched. She called every other day. She drove me to my cardiologist appointment in March, insisted on coming inside, sat with me while the doctor reviewed my blood pressure medication. On the drive home, she asked quiet questions about my health that I told myself were the questions of a worried daughter, not an accountant taking inventory. Her husband had started a landscaping business 4 years earlier that had never quite become what he promised it would. I knew this because my daughter mentioned it the way people mention a headache briefly, in passing, hoping you won't press. He was a pleasant enough man, her husband. Polite at holidays, good with their 2 boys, the kind of person who fixes things around your house without being asked, and then mentions what he fixed 3 or 4 times over the course of the evening. I had always found him a little exhausting. I had never found him alarming. That changed on a Tuesday in October. I was home alone when the mail came. I had been doing the crossword at the kitchen table, the radio on low, a habit I'd picked up because the silence in the house had a texture I hadn't gotten used to yet. The mail was mostly the usual: a water bill, a coupon circular, an envelope from my bank with the quarterly statement for my primary checking account. I almost set it aside. I had been letting my daughter handle the statements, stacking them in the file drawer she'd organized in the study, trusting that if anything needed my attention, she would tell me. But the envelope had opened slightly at the corner, the adhesive not quite holding, and when I picked it up to set it on the stack, I could see the paper inside. I don't know what made me pull it out, some instinct maybe. 30 years of nursing teaches you to notice the small, wrong thing in a room full of right things. The IV drip that's a quarter turn too fast, the chart that's been initialed but not read. I pulled out the statement, and I read it at the kitchen table with the radio still playing and the crossword still unfinished. There were 2 transfers I did not recognize. The first was for $6,000, dated the 2nd of September. The second was for $9,000, dated the 18th of September. Both were listed as authorized transfers to an external account. The account number meant nothing to me. I read the numbers 3 times. Then I stood up and got the navy blue binder from the study and confirmed what I already suspected, that account number was not in it. I sat back down. The radio was playing something cheerful. I turned it off. I want to describe to you exactly what it feels like to sit in your own kitchen, in the house you've lived in for 27 years, and understand that someone you trust has been moving your money without telling you. It doesn't feel like anger. Not at first. It feels like the floor has shifted 2 inches to the left and your body hasn't caught up yet. It feels like standing in a patient's room and realizing the vital signs you've been reading for an hour have been on the wrong monitor. I did not call my daughter. I had learned something in 31 years of nursing that has nothing to do with medicine. When something is wrong, you gather information before you make a sound. You read every chart. You check every line. You do not announce that something is wrong until you know exactly how wrong and to whom and for how long. I called the bank. The woman who answered was named Carol. Or at least, that was what she told me. She had the practiced patience of someone who speaks to upset elderly people on the phone regularly, and I was grateful for it even as I bristled at being handled. I told her I was calling about my checking account and that I had questions about 2 recent transfers. She asked me to verify my identity. I did. She pulled up my account. There was a pause on the line that was just a half-second too long. She asked if I was aware that a power of attorney had been added to my account in April. I told her I was aware. She asked if I was aware that the authorized agent on that power of attorney had made several transactions in the past 4 months. I told her I was not. Another pause. Then, very carefully, she told me that there had been 4 transfers in total since July. $6,000 in July, which I had apparently missed on the previous statement. Then the 2 in September, and a 4th 2 weeks ago for $11,000, which had not yet appeared on the statement I was holding. $32,000. I thanked Carol and asked her to note on my account that I would be coming in to speak with a branch manager. She said she would make that note. I set the phone down on the table, and I sat there for a long time. The thing I kept returning to was the timing. My son-in-law had told me in August that his business had hit a rough patch. He'd mentioned it the way he mentioned everything casually, in passing, with a half smile that suggested it was already being handled. My daughter had changed the subject quickly. I had thought nothing of it at the time, because I had not yet known there was something to think. I did not confront them that evening. I did not confront them the next day, or the day after that, even though my daughter called on Wednesday to ask if I needed anything from the grocery store. And I said no, thank you, and we had a pleasant 5-minute conversation about her younger son's baseball game, and I listened to her voice the entire time, like I was reading a chart I had never been trained to read. On Thursday morning, I drove to the bank. The branch manager's name was a man I'll call Mr. Patterson, steady, professional, the kind of person who has delivered difficult news enough times to do it without flinching. I sat across from him, with my hands folded in my lap, and I told him what I knew. He pulled up the account on his screen. He turned the monitor slightly so I could see it from my angle, which I appreciated more than I told him. The transfers were all listed as authorized under power of attorney. Legally, he explained, with that document in place, the transactions had been permitted. He said the word permitted the way doctors sometimes say, complications technically accurate, carefully chosen, not the word they would use among themselves. He asked if I wished to revoke the power of attorney on the account. I told him I did. He pulled out a form. I signed it. While he was processing it, he asked, gently, whether I had an attorney I trusted. Not the attorney who had drafted the power of attorney document, he specified, in a way that told me he had been in this situation before. Someone independent, someone working only for me. I told him I would find one. I drove home past the elementary school where my daughter had gone to kindergarten, past the hardware store where my husband used to spend his Saturday mornings, past the church where we'd had his memorial service 7 months ago. The leaves were starting to turn. October in Tennessee is genuinely beautiful. The kind of beauty that seems designed to distract you from whatever else is happening. And I let it distract me for exactly the length of the drive home. Then I went inside and I made a list. I am a list maker by nature and by training. In nursing, you learn that a list is not a failure of memory. It is a respect for the complexity of what you're managing. I wrote down everything I needed to do, in order, and I did not write down the thing I was not yet ready to do, which was decide what to do about my daughter. The first item on the list was finding an attorney. A woman from my church, someone I had known casually for 15 years, had mentioned her estate attorney twice in the past year, in ways that had struck me as more recommendation than conversation. I called her that afternoon and asked for the name. She gave it to me without asking why I was asking, for which I was grateful. I called the attorney's office and made an appointment for the following Monday. The attorney was a woman in her early 50s, sharp and unhurried, in a way I found immediately reassuring. I laid out the situation as plainly as I could, the power of attorney, the transfers, the bank's confirmation, my son-in-law's business troubles. She listened without interrupting, which I have learned is rarer than it should be. When I finished, she asked a few specific questions. Had the power of attorney been durable or limited? Had I received any benefit from the transferred funds in any form? Was my daughter listed as a beneficiary in my current will? I answered each question. She took notes. Then she looked up from her notepad and told me, in the same tone she had used for every other sentence, that what I was describing could meet the legal definition of financial elder abuse under Tennessee law. She said it calmly and let the sentence sit there between us. I told her I was not ready to pursue legal action against my daughter. She nodded as if she had expected this answer. She told me that was my choice to make and that she would support whatever I decided, but that she wanted me to understand all my options before I made it. We spent the next hour going through those options. By the time I left her office, I had a clear plan, and it had nothing to do with revenge. It had to do with protection. The second item on my list was the will. My husband and I had written our wills together 17 years earlier with an attorney who had since retired. In that will, I had left the majority of my estate to my daughter, with a smaller portion designated for my son across the country, who is a quieter presence in my life, but a steady one. I called my son that evening from the back porch with a glass of water I kept forgetting to drink, and I told him what I had found. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. He asked if I was okay. I told him I was fine and meant it in the specific way I had learned to mean it over the years, not that nothing was wrong, but that I was standing upright and thinking clearly and managing the wrong thing without being undone by it. He understood the distinction without my explaining it. He asked what he could do. I told him I would let him know. The will was rewritten the following week. I will not go into the specific changes I made because those are private and the details are not the point. The point is that I sat in that attorney's office with my hands folded in my lap, the same way I had sat in the bank manager's office, and I made decisions about my own life that had always been mine to make. The act of signing that document felt like standing up straight after a long time of being slightly hunched. The third item on my list was harder. I had not spoken to my daughter about any of this. For 3 weeks, she had called with her ordinary questions. How's your knee? Did you see the weather coming in? The boys want to visit next weekend, and I had answered each one with the same measured warmth I always used, and I had felt nothing except a dull, persistent ache that I had learned to work around the way you learn to work around any old injury. She came to visit on a Saturday in November. Her husband had a work thing, she said, which in those weeks had taken on a shade of meaning I noticed and did not comment on. She brought a casserole, and the boys, who are 11 and 8 and loud in the way that I genuinely love, the way only grandchildren can be loud, like whether you chose to let inside. I fed them cookies and let them watch television in the living room, and my daughter and I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had opened that bank statement 5 weeks earlier. She was relaxed. That was the thing I noticed. She was warm and easy and entirely relaxed, and I watched her be relaxed the way I had sometimes watched a patient's face when I needed to know what they were actually feeling versus what they were performing. I poured us both coffee. I asked about the boys' school. I asked how things were going with her husband's business. She said better, actually. Things are turning around, and she said it with a small, controlled relief that told me something about the timing of the transfers without her intending to. I did not confront her then. I want to be honest about this, because I know some people would wonder why I didn't. The truth is that I had something more valuable than a confrontation. I had a plan that was already mostly complete. I had removed her access to my accounts. I had rewritten my will. I had a trust being established with my attorney into which my primary assets would transfer over the coming months. What I had not yet decided was what our relationship looked like going forward. I decided, sitting across from her at that table, watching her cup her coffee mug with both hands the way she'd done since she was 19 years old, that I would tell her what I knew. Not to punish her. Not to have an argument. But because I have never been a person who can maintain a relationship on false ground, and because I believe, even now, that she deserved the chance to account for herself, I waited until the boys had gone back to the living room. Then I set my coffee cup down, and I told her, quietly, that I had reviewed my bank statements in October and had found transfers I hadn't authorized. The change in her face was very small and very complete, the way a shift in the weather is small until you realize the temperature has dropped 10 degrees. She didn't deny it immediately, which told me more than a denial would have. She looked down at the table. She said she and her husband had been in a bad place financially, that the landscaping business had nearly collapsed over the summer, and they had been facing the possibility of losing their house. That she had told herself it was temporary, that she was going to tell me, that she was going to pay it back. I listened to all of it without interrupting. Then I asked her one question. I asked whether, if the business had recovered without my noticing the transfers, she would have told me anyway. She didn't answer right away. That pause was its own kind of answer, and we both knew it. I told her what I had done. The bank, the attorney, the power of attorney, revoked. The will, revised. The trust, in progress. I told her that I was telling her this not to threaten her, but because she was my daughter, and I intended to remain her mother, and that was only possible if we were honest with each other going forward. I told her that I did not know yet what going forward looked like, and that I needed time to figure it out, and that she should probably need time too. She cried. I handed her a napkin, because that is what you do, and I felt the complicated weight of loving someone who has hurt you sitting in my chest like a stone that is somehow also warm. I did not cry. I had cried plenty in the weeks before, in private, in the way I had always processed the hardest things thoroughly and alone, and then set aside. Her husband called that evening and asked if he could speak with me. I told him he could. He apologized in the way that men who have been told to apologize often do, thoroughly, with correct words, in an order that suggested he had rehearsed it. I thanked him for calling and told him I hoped he understood that the access he had used was gone and would not be restored. He said he understood. I said good night. I am not going to tell you that everything is fine now, because it isn't. Not entirely. There is a distance between my daughter and me that wasn't there before, a careful quality to our conversations that I suspect will take a long time to ease and may never fully disappear. She calls every week. I answer. We are doing the work of remaining in each other's lives, which is harder than it sounds and more important than I can easily say. What I want to tell you is something that happened last week, which is why I'm sharing this now. I was sitting on the back porch in the early morning with my coffee, the way I do when the weather allows it, watching the light come up over the yard my husband planted 30 years ago, and that I have been tending alone. The leaves are all down now. The oak in the back corner is bare and clean against the sky. It is my favorite version of that tree, stripped of everything unnecessary, showing exactly what it is. I thought about the woman who had sat at the kitchen table 2 years ago and signed a piece of paper because she was grieving and tired, and someone she loved had offered to carry the weight. I understand that woman. I do not judge her, but I am not her anymore. The finances are mine. The decisions are mine. The accounts have one name on them, and that name is mine. And I know the balance without having to ask anyone. It cost $32,000 to learn that I should have been paying attention. I am paying attention now. If you are sitting with something that feels slightly off, a statement you haven't opened, an account you've let someone else manage because it seemed easier, a piece of paper you signed without reading because someone you loved handed it to you at the wrong moment. I want to tell you something that I wish someone had told me before October. Grief does not disqualify you from your own life. Being older does not mean handing the controls to someone younger. Trusting the wrong person is not a failure of character. Catching it and doing something about it that's yours, that belongs to you. The oak tree is bare and still and exactly itself against the morning sky. I finished my coffee and went inside to start the day.